"You'll never be part of this family," yelled the mother-in-law. But years later she returned and shocked all. The room was golden, with late afternoon light, strung with white roses and soft laughter, the kind that dances around champagne flutes and promises of forever. Emma stood near the head table, her ivory dress still perfect despite the hours of photographs, dancing, and obligatory toasts. She was smiling, not the practiced smile of bridal portraits, but something real, something relieved. She had made it. After years of quiet resistance from Jake's family, after countless polite dismissals and cold shoulders, she thought maybe, just maybe, this day would mark a turning point. She had believed, perhaps foolishly, that weddings had a way of melting bitterness, that the celebration of love could loosen even the tightest knots of resentment. She had looked around the room, seeing faces she'd tried hard to impress, and told herself that maybe they were beginning to accept her. She hadn't expected adoration, just decency. But then Linda stood up. Jake's mother didn't raise her glass. She didn't smile. She didn't even blink. The air shifted. Chairs creaked as people turned, their chatter dying mid-sentence. Emma's first instinct was confusion. Maybe Linda was about to toast or share some heartfelt words. Maybe, "You'll never be part of this family." It hit like a slap across the face, every syllable deliberate, venomous, echoing through the stunned silence. A moment ago, someone had been laughing. Now the only sound was the hum of the chandelier overhead and the sudden stillness of 100 guests trying to figure out what they were supposed to do with their hands, their eyes, their stunned expressions. Emma's mouth opened, then closed again. The words didn't come. Her chest burned. She felt heat crawl up her neck, not from embarrassment but from something colder, something rooted in disbelief. The room began to blur at the edges. Her fingers clutched the edge of the table for balance. But the pain didn't come from Linda. It came from Jake. He stood beside her, just inches away. He had heard it too, every word, every pause, every humiliating note. And he did nothing, said nothing. Not a hand on her back, not a single word in her defense. His eyes were wide but frozen, as if someone had pressed pause on his spine. And in that silence, Emma felt something inside her fracture. Not a clean break, a crack, small, deep, definitive. No one moved. Not the bridesmaids, not Jake's cousins who had smiled at her earlier, not even Linda's husband, who stared at his lap like a man hoping to vanish into the linen. Then someone laughed, nervous, too loud. A guest Emma didn't know well. The laughter died as quickly as it had sparked. The DJ glanced around in panic, unsure whether to restart the music. The wedding coordinator whispered something into her earpiece and retreated toward the bar. Emma turned her head slowly toward Jake. She searched his face, pleaded with her eyes. She didn't need a speech. She didn't need drama. She needed a gesture, a word, anything that told her she wasn't alone in this. But Jake's lips were parted uselessly, his body still, his silence roaring. Linda walked away slowly, confidently, leaving behind a crater where celebration had once lived. No one stopped her. Emma felt her throat tighten. Her hands were trembling now, the lace of her dress brushing against her skin like static. She blinked back, the sting in her eyes. Not here, not now. She couldn't cry in front of all these people. A waiter offered her water. She waved it away. Her feet felt foreign inside her shoes. Everything looked wrong. Too bright, too loud, too empty. Jake finally spoke, barely above a whisper. I didn't know she would... Emma raised a hand. Not now. She couldn't handle excuses. Not this soon. The rest of the evening unraveled slowly. A few guests left early. Others avoided eye contact, their smiles forced. The cake was cut, the bouquet was tossed. But the magic was gone, buried beneath shame and disbelief. When they finally made it back to the hotel suite, Emma peeled off her dress in silence. Jake sat on the edge of the bed, head in his hands. He had said sorry twice, but the words felt limp, like patches on a sinking ship. She stared at her reflection in the mirror. Her makeup still intact, her hair still pinned just right, but her eyes were hollow. She didn't scream. She didn't demand explanations or vengeance. She didn't even cry. Instead, she lay down on the bed, turned away from Jake, and pulled the covers over her body like armor. And as the city outside drifted into the small hours of morning, Emma made a quiet decision. She wouldn't be broken by this. She wouldn't shrink to fit someone else's comfort. She wouldn't beg to be loved. She would live and love and raise her child on her terms. And if Jake wanted to come with her, he'd have to learn the difference between being a son and being a man. But for now, she needed sleep. Tomorrow, the world would still be there, and so would she. The move was not planned in the way people usually plan new beginnings. There were no mood boards, no cheerful lists of neighborhoods to explore, no carefully researched schools or community recommendations. It was a desperate leap, the kind taken when staying feels like suffocation. Emma and Jake packed their modest belongings into cardboard boxes that once held grocery store deliveries, loading them into a rented van with a silence that was heavier than any furniture. Each item she folded away felt like she was tucking away the remnants of who she had been before the wedding. The betrayal at the reception had carved out a hollow space inside her chest, but she told herself that perhaps distance could fill it with something new. A new life, a new chapter, a chance to start again. The drive across the country was long and quiet. The highways blurred past, mile after mile of grey concrete and rust-colored landscapes. Jake tried more than once to start conversations about the music on the radio, about the places they passed, about what the new apartment might look like once they decorated. Emma nodded, answered briefly, and sometimes forced a smile, but her responses never grew roots. She wasn't punishing him, not exactly, but she was learning how to carry herself differently. The version of her that had once bent herself into knots trying to earn affection, trying to be enough, had died the night Linda shouted those words. What replaced her was quieter, more guarded, but far sturdier than Jake realized. Their new apartment was small, perched on the 4th floor of a building that smelled faintly of dust and old paint. The walls were thin, the water ran either too cold or scalding hot, and the windows looked out over a parking lot rather than a garden. But it was theirs. No one in this city knew Emma's name. No one looked at her as if she were an intruder in her own marriage. For the first time, she felt that maybe she could breathe without waiting for someone's approval. The silence from Jake's family was immediate and absolute. In the early days, Emma checked the mailbox with a flicker of hope. Perhaps a card, perhaps a note of reconciliation. None ever came. The phone stayed still on the counter, no numbers from his hometown lighting up the screen. She told herself she didn't care, but each absence left a faint sting. When she gave birth to Lily one cold winter evening, the ache became impossible to ignore. The delivery room was filled with nurses, the sterile smell of antiseptic, the sudden cry of a newborn breaking into the world. Emma held her daughter to her chest, overwhelmed by a love so complete it felt like fire pouring into her veins. She glanced at Jake, who was weeping softly, his forehead pressed against their child's tiny hand. For that moment, the silence of his family did not matter. They had created something beyond rejection, something no cruel word could take away. But as the weeks turned into months, the absence grew louder. Friends sent congratulatory gifts. Her own parents drove across the country to meet their granddaughter, filling the small apartment with laughter and warm meals. But Jake's family? Not a single call, not a single card. Emma sometimes caught him staring at his phone late at night, thumb hovering over the screen, as if he wanted to dial but lacked the courage. He would set the phone down eventually, pulling the blanket tighter, pretending he had been looking at something else. Emma never asked. She understood the unspoken weight he carried, torn between blood and loyalty. Yet deep inside, she wondered if she was the chain that kept him from them, the shadow they despised too much to cross. Motherhood demanded her attention, and Emma threw herself into it with a fierceness that surprised even her. Lily became her anchor, her reminder that love could be unconditional and pure. The long nights of crying, the endless feedings, the exhaustion, they were hard, but they were hers. She rocked her daughter by the window, whispering promises of a life filled with safety, strength, and self-worth. Sometimes when Jake came home from work and saw her humming softly to the baby, he would stop at the door, his expression caught between admiration and guilt. She saw it but said nothing. Words would not mend the fractures still spreading in their marriage. Over time, Emma built a rhythm, She learned the streets of their new city, discovered the coffee shop with the friendliest barista, joined a local mothers group where she wasn't judged for being quiet at first. Slowly, she stitched together a semblance of belonging, yet the ache remained, tucked in the corners of her chest like a bruise she could not press without wincing. It wasn't simply that Jake's family had abandoned her, it was that they had abandoned Lily too, a child who had done nothing to deserve silence, a child who should have been celebrated by grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. Instead, she was invisible to them, a ghost in their carefully curated idea of family. Emma wondered, late at night, if she was the root of it all. Had she been too different? Too outspoken? Not enough of what they wanted? She remembered Linda's voice at the wedding, sharp and final, and replayed it in her head like a cruel refrain. "You'll never be part of this family." The more she thought of it, the more she questioned whether Jake, in his quiet moments, felt the same. Was his silence that night a reflection of shock, or was it agreement cloaked in fear? The questions gnawed at her, though she never asked them out loud. To speak them would risk breaking what fragile peace they still had. Time has a way of softening edges, but it does not erase them. By Lily's second birthday, Emma had stopped expecting anything from Jake's side of the family. She told herself she didn't need them, and in many ways she didn't. But sometimes when she watched other children surrounded by grandparents at the park, or heard her friends talk about family visits, a small ache stirred inside her. She swallowed it, kissed Lily's head, and reminded herself that love could be enough when it was real. And then, one quiet evening, as Lily stacked her colorful blocks in the corner and Jake scrolled through his phone on the couch, the silence finally cracked. His phone buzzed with a new message. He opened it, paused, and frowned. Emma glanced at him, her chest tightening. For the briefest moment, hope flickered. Was it his mother, his sister, someone reaching out at last? She leaned closer, trying not to seem desperate, but curious enough to break the unspoken rule of not asking. Jake didn't speak at first. He just stared at the screen, his brows furrowed, his mouth tight. Emma's heart quickened. She set down the cup of tea in her hand, pulse drumming in her ears. She waited. The seconds stretched long. Finally, he turned the phone toward her. A picture glowed on the screen. A family barbecue. Smiling faces. Children running in the grass. Plates piled high with food. Everyone was there. Everyone except Jake, Emma, and Lily. The caption beneath the photo was short, almost mocking in its simplicity. "Family is everything." Emma felt her chest tighten. The words might as well have been another dagger thrown across the years. She forced a small laugh, brittle and sharp, as if she could laugh away the sting. But later that night, after Lily had fallen asleep and the apartment was quiet, she turned to Jake. Her voice was steady, though inside her heart trembled. "Do you regret marrying me?" The question hung in the air, heavier than any silence they had known before. And Jake's answer would change everything. The night stretched long after Emma asked the question that had been buried in her chest for years. "Do you regret marrying me?" She hadn't planned to say it, hadn't rehearsed it in her mind the way she often did with other things. It spilled out like water from a cracked glass, unstoppable once released. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles whitened. The question had been born the moment she saw that photo, his family gathered together, smiling without them, as though their absence was a natural state of things. And the caption, "Family is everything," was the cruelest reminder of where she stood. Jake froze at first, his phone still glowing in his hand. His throat worked, but no sound came. Emma waited, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and anticipation. She didn't want to hear regret, but she needed the truth. She had lived too long in a space where silence was supposed to be enough, where unspoken words had to be interpreted, where absence stood in for answers. Tonight, she would accept no more silence. Finally, Jake set the phone aside and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His voice was low, almost cracked. "No, Emma, I don't regret marrying you. Not for 1 second." He dragged a hand over his face, exhaling hard. "But sometimes, I regret that I couldn't make them accept you. I regret that I let them keep you at arm's length, and I regret that I wasn't stronger that night." His words were unexpected. Emma blinked, caught off guard by the weight of honesty. She had imagined all sorts of answers, from dismissive reassurances to wounded silence, but not this. A confession that he carried shame of his own. For a moment, the sharp edges of her hurt softened, but then another thought pressed in. "Then why?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly. "Why did you stay silent when she humiliated me in front of everyone? You didn't just fail me that night, you abandoned me." Jake's shoulders slumped, as though he had been waiting years to hear those words out loud. "I froze. I was scared," he admitted. "Scared that if I defended you, they would cut me off completely. And I told myself that protecting that tie meant protecting us somehow. But I was wrong. I should have chosen you, Emma. I should have spoken up." The admission hung between them, raw and unpolished. Emma wanted to be relieved, but instead she felt anger tightening in her chest. He had known. All these years, he had known that his silence had been a betrayal, and yet he had lived with it, letting her carry the heaviest part of the wound alone. She stood and walked toward the window, pressing her palm against the cool glass. The city lights blurred outside, distant and unfeeling. "You let me believe it was my fault," she whispered. "Every time they ignored us, every time they excluded us, I thought maybe I was the problem. Maybe if I were different, they'd love me. And all this time, you knew it wasn't me, it was them. And you still said nothing." Jake stood too, his hands outstretched but uncertain whether he was allowed to touch her. "I didn't want to make it worse," he said softly. "I thought, if we gave it time, they'd come around. I thought silence was safer. But I see now that silence only made you feel more alone." Emma turned to face him then, her eyes sharp and wet. "It didn't make me feel alone, Jake. It made me feel disposable." The words sliced through the air, final and irrevocable. He flinched as though struck. And for the first time since that night years ago, Emma felt as though he finally understood the depth of what she had carried. The silence that followed wasn't like the silences before. It wasn't filled with avoidance or cowardice. It was heavy with truth. They stood there, the space between them thick with unspoken choices. Jake's eyes searched hers, desperate, pleading, but Emma could not offer comfort. She had asked the question to find out if their foundation was already cracked beyond repair. His answer told her something different, that the foundation was intact, but it had been neglected, left to weather storms without reinforcement. That night, Jake slept on the couch. Emma lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind spiraling with conflicting thoughts. She loved him, she couldn't deny that. He had been her partner, her companion, the father of her child. But love without defense, love without voice, felt hollow. She remembered the way he had looked when holding Lily for the first time, how his eyes had softened with awe, how his hands had trembled with care. She wanted to believe that man was still the one who shared her life. But trust, once fractured, was slow to heal. Days passed, but the conversation lingered between them. They functioned like partners, cooking meals, sharing chores, playing with Lily. But beneath every exchange lay the unspoken weight of Emma's question and Jake's answer. The message from his family had not just opened an old wound, it had forced them to confront whether they could continue to live with ghosts at the center of their marriage. Emma watched Jake more closely now. She saw the way he hesitated before answering phone calls, the way he glanced at Lily with guilt hidden behind his affection, the way he sometimes stared at her as if trying to memorize her presence. She realized he was afraid, not just of losing his family, but of losing her. And while she had spent years wondering if she was the problem, she now saw the truth. The problem was not her existence in Jake's life. The problem was his inability to defend that existence. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table with Lily babbling happily between them, Emma spoke quietly but firmly. "I don't want to live half-loved anymore, Jake. I don't want to raise our daughter to believe that love can exist in silence, that loyalty can survive without respect. If you want this marriage to last, you need to decide who you are, not who they want you to be, not who you think will keep the peace, who you are when it matters." Jake set down his fork, his jaw tightening. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You're right," he said. "I've been living like a son who never grew up. But you deserve a husband. Lily deserves a father who can show her what love looks like when it's strong, not when it's scared." The words were a start, but Emma knew they were not enough. Promises meant nothing without action. And deep inside, she braced herself for the choice she had demanded he make, not between her and them, but between fear and respect. between silence and voice, between being half a man and being whole. The following night, Jake packed a bag. He didn't say where he was going, only that he needed to think, to face what he had avoided for too long. Emma watched him leave, her arms wrapped around Lily, her chest aching with both fear and hope. The door closed with a quiet click, and the apartment fell into stillness. Days passed. No calls, no messages, just silence once more. Until one evening there was an unexpected knock at the door. The knock on the door came on the fourth evening after Jake left. Emma had not expected it. She had trained herself not to look at the clock, not to linger by the phone, not to let her thoughts drown in what-ifs. Yet her heart still leapt at the sound, betraying her careful facade. Lily was asleep in her room, her small breaths steady through the baby monitor, so Emma rose quietly and walked to the door. Her pulse quickened, the echo of every unanswered question reverberating inside her chest. She pulled it open, half hoping, half dreading, but the doorway was empty. For a long moment, she simply stared at the vacant hall, her heart sinking with disappointment so heavy it threatened to collapse her chest. Then her eyes dropped to the floor, and she saw it. An envelope, sealed, with her name written in Jake's familiar handwriting. She bent down slowly, as if the movement itself required courage, and picked it up. Her fingers trembled as she tore it open, unfolding the letter inside. His words were raw, unpolished, messy in their desperation. He admitted to leaving because he couldn't breathe under the weight of his indecision, because he felt like a coward in her eyes, because he didn't know how to reconcile being the husband she needed and the son he had been taught to be. He wrote about fear, fear of losing his family, fear of losing her, fear of passing that weakness on to their daughter. But at the bottom, there was a line that struck Emma harder than all the rest. I need to decide who I am, and I can't do it standing in the doorway of our apartment, torn in two. I will come back when I know the answer. Until then, take care of our daughter. Take care of yourself. I love you, even if I've failed you. Emma folded the letter carefully, pressing it against her chest. It wasn't resolution. It wasn't even an apology she could hold on to. But it was something. A glimpse into a man finally confronting his fractures. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She simply walked back into the living room, sat on the couch, and let the silence settle around her once more. The days stretched into weeks. Emma threw herself into routines with Lily, making sure her daughter's life felt steady, even as hers wavered. They visited the park, baked small batches of cookies, read storybooks until Lily's eyelids drooped with sleep. Emma smiled, laughed, and held her child close. But every night, when the apartment grew quiet, her gaze drifted toward the door. She had demanded Jake choose between fear and respect, and now she was left waiting for the verdict. When Jake finally returned, it was unannounced. Emma was folding laundry in the living room when the lock turned. She froze, her hands tightening around a small pair of socks before lifting her eyes. He stood in the doorway, thinner than she remembered, his face shadowed by exhaustion. A bag hung at his side, but he carried something else too, an envelope, weathered and yellowed with age. His eyes searched hers, tentative but steady. Without a word, he held it out. Emma hesitated before taking it, her fingertips brushing his for the briefest moment. She sat down and opened the letter, the paper fragile as though it might crumble if handled too roughly. The handwriting was unfamiliar, old-fashioned, but the name at the bottom sent a jolt through her. His father's name. Jake's father had been gone for years, long before Emma had ever joined their lives, a presence more ghost than memory. Yet here he was, his voice captured in ink, reaching across time. The letter was not long, but it was heavy with confession. He wrote of regrets, of mistakes as a husband and father, of the burden he left behind when he died. He spoke directly to Jake, urging him not to let fear dictate his choices, not to let silence destroy the people he loved. And then, in a line that seemed to burn into Emma's mind, he wrote, "Do not let your mother's pain become your inheritance. She has carried anger that was never meant for you. Do not carry it further. Love the family you choose as fiercely as the one you were born into, or you will lose both." Emma's breath caught as she finished reading. She finally understood the bitterness Linda had carried, the venom she had unleashed at the wedding, the coldness that had wrapped around them for years. It had never been about Emma. It had been about wounds left by someone else, wounds Jake's father himself had recognized. Suddenly the pieces began to fit. The resentment, the distance, the way Linda seemed to push her away before she could ever truly step closer. She lifted her gaze to Jake, whose eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Where did you find this?" she asked softly. He swallowed hard. "In a box of his things. Mum kept it hidden. I found it when I went back." His voice cracked. "She never showed me. Maybe she thought it didn't matter. Maybe she thought she was protecting me. But reading it was like hearing him speak after all these years." Emma held the letter against her lap, her thoughts racing. It didn't excuse Linda's cruelty. It didn't erase the humiliation she had endured or the years of silence that followed. But it explained something deeper, something buried beneath anger and pride. The realization left her both relieved and unsettled. For the first time, she wondered if Linda's rejection had been less about Emma herself and more about the shadows of her own past. Jake knelt in front of her, his hands trembling as he reached for hers. "I don't want to keep living like this," he said. "I don't want fear to dictate every choice I make. I love you, I love Lily, and I want to be the kind of man my father wished I'd be, not the son who hides behind silence. I don't know how to fix all of this, but I want to try." Emma looked at him, her heart caught between old wounds and fragile hope. Part of her longed to believe him, to lean into the promise of change. Another part feared being disappointed again, feared that this moment of clarity would fade as quickly as it had come. But she knew one thing with certainty. The letter had opened a door that could not be closed. The past was no longer just her burden or Jake's confusion. It was a truth they both had to face. She squeezed his hand gently, her voice steady though her emotions churned beneath the surface. "Then prove it, Jake. Not with promises, with choices, with actions." She glanced down at the letter once more, the words of his father echoing in her mind. "Do not let your mother's pain become your inheritance." The words were a warning, but also an invitation. The path ahead would not be simple, but for the first time, Emma saw the possibility of something beyond survival. That night, after Lily was asleep and the house had grown quiet, Emma placed the letter on the nightstand. It sat there like a fragile relic, a reminder of truths long buried. She lay beside Jake, not touching him, but no longer turning away either. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future that might look different, not free of pain, but shaped by the choice to confront it rather than carry it in silence. What Emma didn't know was that the letter, once hidden, had set something far larger in motion. Old wounds had been stirred, and the confrontation it hinted at was no longer years away. It was closer than she could imagine, waiting just beyond the horizon, ready to shake the fragile balance of everything she and Jake were trying to rebuild. The days that followed Jake's return unfolded like a fragile truce. Emma could feel the change in him, the heaviness of the letter weighing on his shoulders, shaping the way he moved through their small apartment. He was quieter, not in the way he had been before when silence meant avoidance, but in a way that suggested he was listening, really listening for the first time in years. He rose early, made Lily's breakfast, sat with her while she colored, and when Emma looked at him across the table, she saw a man who was carrying both guilt and resolve. Yet beneath the stillness, something else simmered, the unspoken presence of his father's words, a revelation that had cracked open the story of his family in a way Emma could not yet fully understand. The letter lay on the nightstand for days. Emma read it more than once, each time uncovering layers she hadn't noticed before. It wasn't simply a father's regretful farewell. It was a map of hidden scars written in trembling ink. His warning about Linda, his plea not to let her pain become Jake's inheritance, haunted Emma most of all. It explained so much, yet raised even more questions. What pain had Linda carried so fiercely that it spilled over into her son's marriage? What betrayal or wound had hardened her so deeply that she could look at Emma on her wedding day and see not a daughter-in-law but an enemy? Emma found herself pacing the living room late at night, staring at the letter, tracing the words with her finger, as if by doing so she might pull more truth from them. She wanted to hate Linda with the same clarity as before, but the letter blurred the edges of her anger. It made her wonder if Linda's cruelty had been born not from spite alone, but from something older, heavier, festering, long before Emma entered the family. And that thought unsettled her, because it meant Linda's venom had never truly been about her at all. Jake, too, seemed unable to put the letter aside. He carried it in his bag when he left for work, as though afraid to be separated from it. Sometimes Emma would catch him rereading it at the kitchen counter, his lips pressed tightly together, his eyes glazed with memory. Once, he confessed in a voice that cracked with emotion, "I don't know if I ever really knew him, Emma. He was there, but he wasn't. He worked, he provided, but he never spoke like this. It's like he waited until death was at his door to finally tell me the truth. And now I don't know if I can forgive him for leaving this mess for me to clean up." Emma didn't answer right away. She understood the bitterness, but she also saw something Jake didn't, that the letter was not just a confession, but an opportunity. It was the first time she had ever seen Linda's cruelty explained rather than endured. And though Emma wasn't ready to forgive, she knew the letter had shifted something inside her. She could no longer see Linda as simply a villain. She was something far more complicated, a woman repeating cycles of pain she hadn't been able to escape. But knowledge didn't erase Emma's wounds. She still carried the humiliation of that wedding day, the years of silence, the sharp sting of exclusion. Knowing the origin of Linda's bitterness didn't undo the scars it had left. And as much as Emma wanted to embrace the possibility of healing, she knew one truth: forgiveness could never be forced. It had to be earned, step by painful step. It was Lily, as always, who grounded her. At 5 years old, she was a whirlwind of energy and innocence, blissfully unaware of the fractures in her family. She danced through the apartment with ribbons tied to her wrists, demanded bedtime stories with elaborate voices, and often pressed her small face against Emma's cheek, whispering, "You're my best friend, Mommy." In those moments, Emma felt both invincible and fragile. She knew she had to shield Lily from the darkness of the past, to teach her that love could be safe and whole. Yet she also knew that one day, Lily would ask about the grandmother she had never met, and Emma would have to decide what story to tell. It was on one such evening, after tucking Lily into bed, that Jake sat down beside Emma with an expression that unsettled her. He placed the letter on the table again, his hand resting on it as though steadying himself. "There's something I haven't told you," he said slowly. "When I went back to the house to look for Dad's things, Mom caught me. She saw me reading the letter, and for the first time in my life I saw her shaken. She didn't yell, she didn't lash out. She just looked at me, pale and quiet, and said, 'That letter wasn't meant for you.' Then she walked out of the room." Emma's breath caught. "Not meant for you? Who was it meant for then?" Jake shook his head. "I don't know. Maybe she meant it wasn't meant to be read at all. Or maybe it was meant for her. I keep turning it over in my mind, wondering if that's why she hid it all these years. If those words, those regrets, were a mirror she couldn't face." Emma leaned back in her chair, her thoughts spinning. The revelation changed everything. If the letter had been hidden not from Jake but from Linda herself, then it wasn't just a confession. It was a wound buried deep in the heart of the family. And that meant the resentment Linda carried toward Emma might not have been about rejection at all. It might have been about guilt, shame, and the unbearable weight of truth. The realization left Emma with a strange mixture of dread and determination. On one hand, she wanted nothing more than to protect herself and Lily from whatever storm was brewing in Linda's silence. On the other, she knew that storms did not disappear simply because one turned away. They grew, they gathered force, and sooner or later, they demanded to be faced. That night, as Jake slept beside her, Emma lay awake staring at the ceiling, the letter heavy on the nightstand once again. She could almost hear his father's voice in the stillness, urging her not to let Linda's pain become the inheritance passed down to Lily. And she realized with a clarity that left her both frightened and resolute that the letter was not just Jake's burden. It was hers too. A warning, a key, and perhaps, if she was brave enough, a doorway. She didn't know then how close the confrontation truly was. She didn't know that the past had already begun to stir, pulling threads that would unravel everything she thought she understood about her marriage, her mother-in-law, and the family she had been told she'd never belong to. What she did know as she lay in the dark was that she would no longer live passively in the shadows of other people's choices. Whatever the truth was, she was ready to face it. And in the years that followed, that choice would define not only her future, but Lily's as well. For the letter had done more than reveal the past. It had planted the seed of a reckoning long overdue. Years moved forward with the steady rhythm of everyday life. Though beneath it ran currents of unresolved tension, Emma found her strength in Lily, who grew from a curious toddler into a sharp and imaginative little girl. Her laughter filled the apartment, her drawings cluttered the fridge, and her questions often forced Emma to confront truths she wasn't ready to face. Jake, for his part, kept his promise to be more present. He defended their little family fiercely within the small world they built together, though contact with his mother remained strained, nearly non-existent except for obligatory holiday gestures. Even then, he usually went alone. Emma never asked to accompany him, and he never insisted. It was an unspoken agreement, born not from peace but from survival. Still, the shadow of the past lingered. The letter had not left Emma's thoughts. She had read it so many times she could recite parts of it by heart, and each reading left her with the same gnawing realization: Linda's cruelty had not sprung from nothing. It had roots, and those roots were buried in a pain Emma did not fully understand. She tried to push the thought away, to remind herself that understanding a wound did not erase the damage it had caused. Yet she also knew something had shifted in her. The anger she once clutched like a shield had softened into something more complex, something closer to wary curiosity than rage. Lily, now old enough to notice the gaps in her family tree, began asking questions. "Do I have another grandma?" she asked one evening as Emma tucked her into bed. Emma hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, you do." Lily's eyes widened with excitement. "Then why doesn't she visit me? Did I do something wrong?" The innocence of the question pierced Emma's heart. She reassured her daughter quickly, telling her she had done nothing wrong, that sometimes adults carried heavy things that made it hard for them to be kind. Lily accepted the explanation with a sleepy nod, but the moment stayed with Emma long after the lights were out. She didn't want her daughter to inherit silence and estrangement as her family's legacy. It was almost 6 years after the wedding when Emma received the unexpected message. Her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. Against her better judgment, she answered. On the other end, a voice she hadn't heard in years spoke, deliberate and sharp. "Emma, it's Linda, we need to talk." Emma froze, her body tightening as though bracing for impact. She had imagined this moment countless times, rehearsing in her head what she would say if it ever came. Some days she pictured herself hanging up immediately, reclaiming her power by refusing to give Linda a second of her life. Other days, she imagined unleashing years of rage in one blistering tirade. But in reality, all she felt was a strange, heavy calm. She listened as Linda named a time and place, a quiet cafe on the edge of the city, and then hung up without waiting for a response. Emma almost didn't go. For hours she paced the apartment, torn between self-preservation and the nagging sense that the letter had brought her here for a reason. Jake, when she told him, offered no clear advice. He looked torn, his brow furrowed, as he admitted he didn't know if meeting his mother would heal anything or simply wound her deeper. But Emma saw in his eyes the same truth she felt in her chest. They could not keep running from the past forever. The cafe smelled of roasted coffee and cinnamon, a place designed for warmth. Yet when Emma walked in and spotted Linda at a corner table, the air seemed to chill. Her mother-in-law looked older, the years etched deep into her face, her shoulders slightly hunched as though carrying an invisible burden. But her eyes, sharp, calculating, were the same as Emma remembered. Emma drew in a steadying breath and approached. She expected Linda to look at her with disdain, but instead there was something else in her gaze, a flicker of unease. Emma sat, folding her hands neatly on the table, determined to hold herself steady, no matter what storm this conversation unleashed. But then, before Emma could even speak, she realized Linda wasn't alone. Another woman sat across from her, unfamiliar, yet strangely confident, her presence calm in contrast to Linda's tension. She was perhaps a decade older than Emma, with eyes that mirrored Linda's but softer, kinder. She offered Emma a small smile, one that felt both knowing and gentle. Linda cleared her throat, but the other woman spoke first. "Emma, I'm Caroline, Linda's sister." Emma blinked in surprise. She hadn't even known Linda had a sister. No one had ever mentioned her, yet here she was, seated at the same table, looking at Emma as though she had been waiting for this moment a long time. Confusion prickled through Emma, but she kept her expression neutral. "Why am I here?" she asked, her voice steady. Caroline leaned forward slightly, her hands folded, her voice carrying a quiet conviction. "Because you need to understand the truth about what happened to you, and because Linda needs to hear it too." Emma's stomach tightened. Truth. That word carried weight. She looked at Linda, who stared down at her coffee cup, her lips pressed thin. For once the older woman had nothing sharp to say, no venom to spit. The silence itself was unsettling. Caroline took a slow breath, her eyes fixed on Emma. "You think Linda hates you because of who you are, because of something you did. But that's not it. Emma, years ago when Linda married, she went through exactly what you did. Her husband's family rejected her. They told her she didn't belong, that she would never be part of them, and she carried that wound into every part of her life. Instead of breaking the cycle, she repeated it. She didn't reject you because of who you are. She rejected you because she couldn't face her own pain." The word struck Emma like a blow. She sat back in her chair, her breath shallow. The pieces clicked together in a way that made terrible, perfect sense. The venom at her wedding, the years of silence, the relentless coldness. It hadn't been personal after all. It had been a reenactment, a cruel mirror of Linda's own suffering. Emma turned to Linda then, her voice low, trembling with both fury and clarity. "Is that true?" Linda's eyes lifted, glistening not with anger, but with something Emma had never seen in her before: shame. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, with a sudden motion, she pushed back her chair and stood. Her hands shook as she pressed them against the table, her face pale and stricken. But instead of speaking, she turned abruptly and walked out of the cafe, leaving Caroline and Emma staring after her. The bell over the door jingled as it shut behind her, and the silence that followed was deafening. Emma's heart pounded. She wanted to chase her, to demand answers, to force Linda to face what she had done. But her body remained frozen in place. Caroline reached across the table, her voice soft but firm. "You didn't deserve any of it, Emma. You were never the problem. She just couldn't bear to see in you what she once was. And until she can face that, she'll keep running." Emma swallowed hard, her eyes fixed on the door where Linda had disappeared. She had come expecting anger, perhaps even another humiliation. Instead, she had been handed the truth, a truth that changed everything. For the first time, Emma realized that the battle she had been fighting all these years had never truly been with Linda. It had been with the echoes of a past she had never lived, and though the revelation didn't erase her pain, it gave her something new: clarity. But clarity was not peace. It was only the beginning of another storm, and Emma, though steadier than before, knew that facing what lay ahead would demand more strength than she had ever imagined. Emma sat motionless in the cafe, her pulse still racing from the confrontation that had ended with Linda's abrupt departure. The silence left behind seemed louder than the clatter of dishes or the low hum of conversation around her. Caroline remained calm, her gaze steady, but Emma's mind was in turmoil. She had come expecting hostility, perhaps another round of venom disguised as conversation, but instead, she had been handed a confession wrapped in family history. Linda's rejection, her cruelty, her bitterness, it had all been a reflection of her own past, a cycle she had chosen not to break, but to inflict on someone else. Emma pressed her hands together on the table, trying to ground herself, but the weight of revelation pressed harder with every passing second. Caroline leaned forward, her voice gentle but deliberate. "I know this isn't easy to hear. I debated reaching out to you for years, but I could see where things were heading. Linda has always struggled with her pride. She can't admit that she is repeating the same cruelty she once endured. It's easier for her to lash out than to face what was done to her." Emma finally found her voice, though it trembled when it escaped her lips. "Why tell me this now? Why not sooner?" Caroline sighed, a sadness flickering across her features. "Because for a long time I thought she might change on her own. I thought she might see what she was doing to you, to Jake, to Lily. But she hasn't. And now you deserve to know that none of this was ever your fault. You were caught in the crossfire of a war. She was fighting with ghosts from her past." Emma clenched her jaw, the bitter taste of anger rising in her throat. It didn't erase the memory of standing in her wedding dress while a room full of people watched her humiliation. It didn't erase the years of silence, the way her daughter had been ignored as though she didn't exist. Understanding Linda's pain did not undo Emma's own. Knowing she was hurt doesn't change that she hurt me, Emma said quietly but firmly. It doesn't erase the fact that she let her wounds poison everything around her. She made a choice, Caroline. She chose cruelty. Caroline nodded slowly, her expression solemn. You're right, she did. And maybe she will never undo that choice. But if she ever does come to you again, if she ever tries to face what she's done, I hope you'll remember what I told you today. Not for her sake, but for yours, and for Lily's. You don't have to forgive her, but you can free yourself from believing her rejection was about you. Emma swallowed hard. For years she had lived with the suspicion that she was the problem, that her presence in Jake's life was what had fractured his family. She had carried that burden quietly, wondering if she was to blame for every silence, every absence, every empty chair at holidays. And now, with Caroline's words, the burden shifted. It didn't disappear, but it no longer belonged to her alone. It had always been Linda's, heavy with history and shame. For a moment, Emma felt a strange wave of relief, followed quickly by something darker. Grief. Grief for the years she had spent doubting herself. Grief for the moments she had let herself shrink in an attempt to belong. Grief for Lily, who had been robbed of a grandmother not because of who she was, but because of wounds she had never caused. Caroline reached across the table, her hand brushing lightly against Emma's. You're stronger than she realizes. That strength is what scares her. Don't let her fear become your prison. Emma met Caroline's gaze, seeing not pity, but recognition. There was something in Caroline's eyes that told Emma she had once stood in her place, that she too had fought to step out from under Linda's shadow. And in that moment, Emma understood that the woman across from her wasn't just a messenger. She was proof that survival was possible, even when family turned into battlegrounds. The sound of the cafe door opening pulled Emma's attention back. For a fleeting moment, she half expected Linda to return, to storm back with another wave of anger or denial. But it wasn't her. The door closed again, leaving Emma with the echo of her mother-in-law's exit and the image of her back as she fled rather than face the truth. Emma exhaled, her chest tight. She didn't even deny it, she whispered, more to herself than to Caroline. She just left. Caroline's expression softened, because denial is easier than confession. Facing you means facing herself, and she's not ready. Maybe she never will be. Emma nodded slowly, her thoughts racing ahead. What if Linda never did return? What if she continued her life in silence, refusing to face the truth until the end? Was Emma ready to live with that? Could she accept that some wounds would never heal, that some apologies would never come? She left the cafe with Caroline's words echoing in her mind. The city lights flickered against the pavement as Emma walked to her car, her steps steady though her emotions churned within her. She didn't look back. She didn't expect to see Linda following her. She simply drove home, her hands gripping the wheel tightly, her heart pounding with a mixture of clarity and unresolved rage. That night, as she tucked Lily into bed and listened to her soft breathing, Emma felt the full weight of what had happened. She realized that the rejection she had endured all these years was not a reflection of her worth. It had never been about her at all. But she also realized something more dangerous. Linda had not finished her story. The silence that followed her exit from the cafe wasn't peace. It was a storm gathering strength. Emma lay awake for hours, staring into the darkness, her mind replaying the scene. Caroline's voice, Linda's silence, her own trembling questions, all of it intertwined into a single truth. She had been living in the shadow of a woman's unresolved pain. And now, whether she wanted it or not, she was tangled in the threads of that history. But Emma knew one thing with certainty. She would not let Lily grow up repeating the same patterns. She would not let her daughter inherit the silence, the bitterness, the cycles of rejection. Whatever storm was coming, she would face it. Not for Linda, not even for Jake, for herself, and most of all for Lily. Still, Emma couldn't shake the image of Linda's eyes just before she fled, eyes brimming with something dangerously close to tears. It wasn't the look of a woman full of hatred. It was the look of someone cornered by her own reflection. And Emma, though unwilling to admit it, felt a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was pity, perhaps it was fear, or perhaps, against all reason, it was the first fragile thread of understanding, one that could unravel everything if pulled too soon. Months passed after the cafe meeting, and life seemed to settle back into its familiar rhythm. Emma thought often of Caroline's words, replaying them in her mind, turning them over like fragile glass that might shatter if handled too roughly. Linda's abrupt exit from the cafe had left a hollow kind of silence, one that felt different from the years before. It wasn't the silence of dismissal or rejection this time. It was the silence of retreat, the pause of someone running from the weight of truth. Still, the absence was sharp. Days passed, then weeks, then months. Not a single call, not a single letter, not even a trace of acknowledgement. Linda had vanished back into her world, leaving Emma suspended in a strange limbo. At first, Emma convinced herself this was a blessing. After all, wasn't this what she had always wanted? Distance, freedom. No more venom at her doorstep. No more icy glances meant to slice her to pieces. She told herself she was content with the quiet, with raising Lily in a home free of Linda's shadow. And for a while, it felt almost true. She poured herself into work, into Lily's school projects, into creating a home that radiated warmth and safety. She smiled when her daughter laughed. She felt pride when Jake took on the role of father more firmly than before. And she told herself that the silence had finally become peace. But deep down, she knew better. It wasn't peace. It was waiting. She could feel it in her bones, a sense that something unfinished hovered on the edge of their lives, biding its time. The letter from Jake's father still lay in her drawer, folded and worn from her fingertips. She kept it not just because it explained the past, but because it warned of what might still come. She told herself that if Linda returned, she would be ready. She wouldn't be blindsided again. She wouldn't allow herself to be humiliated or silenced. And then it happened. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Lily, now 7 years old, came bounding through the front door after school, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. Her cheeks were flushed with excitement, her small hands clutching a piece of paper. "Mom!" she cried, her voice bubbling with joy. "Look what I made today." She thrust the paper into Emma's hands. Emma smiled automatically, ready to admire another one of Lily's endless drawings. But the smile faltered as her eyes took in the picture. It was a simple sketch in crayons, a child with brown hair, holding hands with a taller woman with silver hair. Above them, in Lily's neat handwriting, were the words, "Me and Grandma." Emma's chest tightened. She forced her voice to stay steady. "Sweetheart, who is this?" Lily beamed, her eyes shining. "It's me and Grandma. She came to see me at school today. She said she missed me. She even gave me a candy." Lily's words spilled out without hesitation, innocent and bright. The room seemed to tilt. Emma gripped the drawing, her mind spinning. She had not given permission for this. She had not been asked. Linda had appeared uninvited, stepping into her daughter's life as though nothing had happened, as though the years of silence and rejection could be erased with a piece of candy. Emma crouched down, her voice gentle though her stomach churned with anger. "Lily, what did Grandma say to you?" "She just said she loves me," Lily replied matter-of-factly. "She said she wanted to see me again soon. Can she, Mom?" Her innocent question sliced through Emma's chest. Emma swallowed hard, forcing a smile to keep her daughter's world unshaken. "We'll talk about it later, okay? Go wash up for dinner." As soon as Lily skipped down the hall, Emma's mask dropped. Her hands shook as she held the crayon drawing, her heart pounding with fury and fear. Linda had crossed a line. This wasn't about Emma anymore. This was about Lily, about stepping into her life without warning, without permission, without reckoning with the pain she had caused. Emma didn't wait. She grabbed her keys, her body moving before her mind caught up. She drove straight to Linda's house, her jaw clenched, her thoughts sharp and focused. She had told herself she wouldn't be blindsided again, and yet here she was, blindsided in the worst possible way. When she pulled up in front of the familiar house, her chest tightened further. It looked the same as ever, neatly kept, curtains drawn, flowers blooming in the front yard. Ordinary, but Emma knew better. She stepped out of the car, her footsteps quick and unyielding as she marched to the door. Through the front window, she froze. Linda was sitting in the living room, alone, her posture slumped in a way Emma had never seen before. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a lamp. But what caught Emma's attention wasn't Linda's figure. It was the walls. They were covered with photographs. Old ones, new ones, dozens of them. Jake as a boy, his father in younger years. Family gatherings Emma had never been invited to, and among them, Lily. Pictures of Lily. School photos Emma had posted online, snapshots she hadn't realized Linda had saved, even one Emma herself had taken and shared privately with Jake. They were taped carefully to the walls, arranged like a shrine. Emma's breath caught, her body trembling. She stepped closer to the window, her anger and fear colliding with something else, something she couldn't quite name. On the coffee table in front of Linda sat an envelope, her name written across it in careful, deliberate handwriting. Emma's fists clenched at her sides. She could storm in, demand answers, unleash the fury she had carried for years, but instead she stood frozen at the window, staring at the shrine of photographs, at the envelope, waiting for her. Linda had not disappeared into silence. She had been watching, waiting, and now she had returned, not with venom, but with something Emma had never expected, an apology. And the storm Emma had feared was no longer on the horizon. It was here, in this house, in the walls lined with memories Emma had not known existed, in the envelope that bore her name. Emma's hand hovered above the door handle, her breath unsteady as she stood outside Linda's home. Through the window she could still see the living room, the walls covered with photographs that looked both tender and haunting. It was as if Linda had built a gallery of everything she had once denied, a silent admission that the family she had pushed away had never truly left her heart. But the sight of her daughter's face pinned among them like a memory stolen without permission ignited a storm inside Emma's chest. She pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking as if warning her to turn back. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lavender and dust, the air heavy with stillness. Linda didn't move when Emma entered. She remained seated on the couch, her eyes fixed on the envelope on the table. For a moment neither spoke. The only sound was the faint ticking of a clock in the corner, each beat echoing like a drum in Emma's ears. Finally, Emma stepped forward and picked up the envelope. Her name, written in Linda's careful script, seemed out of place after years of silence. She sat down in the chair across from her mother-in-law, her movements deliberate, refusing to let her hands shake. Slowly, she slid a finger beneath the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was uneven, the strokes wavering in places as though written through hesitation. Emma read quietly, her heart pounding with each line. "Emma, I do not know how to start this, because I have never been good at starting anything with honesty. I told myself for years that my silence was strength, that keeping you away was protection, that my bitterness was justified. But the truth is simpler. I was afraid. Afraid of losing my son to someone else's love. Afraid of facing the same rejection I once endured. Afraid that if I let you in, I would see myself in you. And so I punished you for a wound you did not create." Emma's throat tightened as her eyes moved across the page. "I hurt you on your wedding day because I wanted to control what I could not accept. I made your life harder because it was easier than admitting I was broken. I kept Lily away because I could not bear to see the joy of something I had destroyed for myself. I was wrong, terribly, unforgivably wrong. If I have to live the rest of my days as a stranger to you, then I will. I deserve that. But please do not let Lily grow up thinking her grandmother never wanted her. Let her know I was wrong, that the fault was mine and mine alone. And if you can find it in your heart, let me show her that I see her, not as a prize, not as a replacement, but as a child who deserves to be loved without condition." At the bottom, the ink blurred slightly, as though the pen had trembled with tears. Emma sat still for a long moment, the letter heavy in her hands. She wanted to feel triumph, to know that her years of pain had finally been acknowledged, that Linda had admitted fault. But instead she felt something else, grief, sharp and unexpected. Grief for the years lost, for the moments stolen, for the child who had asked why her grandmother didn't visit. When she finally lifted her gaze, Linda was watching her carefully, her face pale but steady. No excuses, no venom, no attempt to reclaim control. Just waiting for judgment, for forgiveness, for something Emma wasn't sure she was ready to give. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but firm. "You don't get to walk into Lily's life, just because you've decided you're ready. You don't get to undo years of silence with one letter. Linda's eyes glistened, but she didn't argue. She only nodded once, as though she had expected nothing less. Emma stood, clutching the letter. She took one last look at the photographs taped to the walls, the shrine of a past Linda had both destroyed and preserved. Her anger, her sorrow, her confusion all pressed against each other inside her chest. But she refused to let them spill out here, in this house that was no longer hers to battle. Without another word, she turned and walked out, the letter burning in her hand, like a fragile piece of truth she hadn't yet decided what to do with. Outside, the air felt colder, sharper. Emma leaned against her car for a moment, staring up at the sky. She had come looking for confrontation, and instead she had been given something more complicated, a confession that blurred the line between villain and victim, cruelty and brokenness. She drove home slowly, the letter resting on the passenger seat. When she arrived, Lily was already asleep, her small body curled beneath her blanket, the innocence of childhood untouched by the weight of adult choices. Emma tucked the letter into her drawer, beside Jake's father's words, the two confessions lying together like bookends to the history she had been forced to inherit. For hours, she lay awake, replaying the letter in her mind, hearing Linda's words echo in the silence. She didn't know if forgiveness would ever be possible. She didn't know if she could trust Linda enough to let her into Lily's life. But for the first time, she knew one thing with certainty. The war was no longer hidden. The truth had been spoken, written in ink, impossible to erase. And though Emma didn't yet know it, that letter would not be the end of Linda's presence. It was only the beginning of a fragile, dangerous attempt to bridge the gap between them. A bridge that could either hold or crumble, with Lily standing at the center of it all. The letter stayed tucked in Emma's drawer for days, then weeks, untouched but never forgotten. Each time she opened the drawer to retrieve a pair of socks or place away folded laundry, her eyes would brush against the neat fold of the paper, and her chest would tighten. She could not bring herself to read it again, yet she also could not let it out of sight. It felt like both a weapon and a plea, fragile and sharp, waiting for her decision. Jake noticed her silence but did not press. He had seen the shift in her eyes the night she returned from Linda's house, the way her hands lingered on Lily's hair a little longer as she tucked her in, the way her gaze turned distant when she thought no one was looking. He asked once gently if she wanted to talk, but Emma had only shaken her head. Not yet. He accepted that answer, though his worry hovered between them like an invisible shadow. Life moved forward, as life always does. School mornings, packed lunches, bedtime routines. Lily grew taller, her questions sharper, her laughter louder. But Emma carried the weight of the letter through it all, unsure how to place it in the narrative of their lives. Linda's words had been raw, unguarded, a confession Emma never thought she would hear. Yet what did an apology mean when years had been lost, when a child had been ignored, when wounds had been carved so deep? Could paper and ink ever balance a scale so heavy with pain? One evening, as Emma prepared dinner, Lily appeared at her side holding the crayon drawing she had made weeks before, the one of herself and Grandma. Her small fingers clutched the paper with pride, her eyes searching Emma's face. "Mom, do people mean it when they say sorry? Does that make them good again?" The question pierced Emma deeper than she expected. She set down the spoon she was holding and knelt beside her daughter, taking her hand gently. Lily's eyes were wide, innocent, filled with the kind of trust only a child could carry. Emma felt her throat tighten. She realized this moment was not about Linda at all. It was about what she wanted Lily to learn about the world, about love, about forgiveness, about mistakes. She brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's face. Sometimes when people say sorry, it means they know they've done something wrong. It doesn't make everything better right away, but it can be the first step to changing. What matters is if they show with their actions that they really mean it. Lily considered this, her small brow furrowed in concentration. "So, if Grandma says sorry, does that mean she can come to see me?" Emma swallowed hard. The weight of the question pressed against her chest. She didn't want to answer too quickly, didn't want to let her own wounds dictate the lessons her daughter would carry. Slowly she nodded. Maybe, but it would have to be on the right terms. Because being sorry means showing respect, and respect is something we should never live without. Lily smiled at that, satisfied with the answer, and ran back to her toys. But Emma remained kneeling on the kitchen floor, her heart pounding. Her daughter had unknowingly opened a door Emma had been trying to keep closed. The question lingered long after Lily left the room. If she denied Linda entirely, what lesson would Lily learn about the possibility of change? And if she opened the door too wide, what danger would she invite into their lives again? That night, after Lily was asleep, Emma sat with Jake at the kitchen table. She laid the letter between them, smoothing the paper with her fingertips. "She apologized," Emma said softly, her voice carrying both disbelief and exhaustion. In her way, she admitted everything. She said if I never let her in again, she would accept it. But she asked me to let Lily know she was wrong. And Jake... Emma's voice broke slightly. "Lily asked me if saying sorry makes someone good again. What do I tell her?" Jake's eyes darkened with thought. He reached across the table, resting his hand over hers. "You tell her the truth. That saying sorry doesn't erase the past, but it shows a choice about the future. You don't owe my mother forgiveness, Emma. But maybe Lily deserves to know that people can grow, even if they once failed terribly." Emma exhaled slowly, her heart heavy with the weight of choice. She knew Jake was right. This wasn't about rewarding Linda or validating her years of cruelty. It was about teaching their daughter what love looked like when it was strong enough to face pain. The decision did not come easily. Emma wrestled with it for days, her thoughts swinging between anger and compassion, between caution and hope. But finally, she made a choice. She would allow a chance, not for Linda's sake, but for Lily's. Yet it would come with conditions. No more secrecy, no more boundaries crossed, no more words meant to wound. If Linda wanted a place in their daughter's life, it would have to be earned step by step, with respect as the foundation. Emma wrote a short letter of her own, her handwriting steady though her emotions swirled beneath the surface. She did not offer forgiveness, but she offered clarity. She told Linda that she was willing to consider the possibility of contact, but only under the condition that Lily's safety and trust remained unbroken. She told her that this was not a second chance to wound, but a test to prove that she could finally love without fear or control. The letter was mailed without ceremony, slipped into a box on a quiet afternoon. Emma did not tell Lily. She did not even tell Jake until days later. She wanted no expectations, no fragile hope that might break her daughter's heart. Weeks passed without a response. Emma told herself she was not surprised, that silence was Linda's most fluent language. She moved forward, carrying the weight of her choice quietly. But then came Lily's school play. It was a small production, the kind where paper crowns and unevenly painted backdrops carried more pride than any grand stage. Emma arrived early, taking her seat in the front row with Jake beside her, her camera ready to capture every moment. She glanced at the row of chairs set aside for family and felt the familiar sting of emptiness. She had invited Linda, sending the date along with her conditions. But the chair remained vacant, its stillness a reminder that some wounds could not be mended. The lights dimmed, the children took their places, and Emma let herself focus on Lily, her heart swelling with pride. She was radiant, her voice clear, her smile bright. Emma clapped loudly, tears stinging her eyes as she watched her daughter shine. Halfway through the play, movement caught her attention at the back of the room. She turned and froze. Linda stood quietly by the door, her hair pulled back, her hands clutching a bouquet of small flowers. Her eyes glistened with tears, but she did not move forward, did not take a seat. She stood apart, silent, respectful, watching as her granddaughter spoke her lines. She made no scene, asked for no attention. She simply witnessed, her face filled with something Emma had never seen in her before: humility. Emma's chest tightened. She glanced at Lily, then back at Linda, caught between memory and possibility. Something inside her shifted, fragile but undeniable. And when the play ended, with applause filling the small auditorium, Emma knew she could no longer ignore the truth. The ice that had held them apart for so many years had finally begun to crack. The school auditorium was still buzzing with chatter and applause when Emma saw Linda at the back of the room, clutching the flowers as if they were her only anchor. For a moment, Emma thought she was imagining it, that her mind, so preoccupied with the letter and the ache of empty seats, had conjured a vision of reconciliation that wasn't real. But no, she was there. Not approaching, not demanding, not asserting herself into a place she hadn't earned, but simply standing, watching, waiting. Emma's first instinct was to turn away, to pretend she hadn't noticed, to protect herself from the fragile hope threatening to bloom in her chest. But then Lily spotted her. The little girl's eyes widened in recognition, her small hand tugging at Emma's sleeve. "Mom, look, it's Grandma." Her voice carried no hesitation, no fear, only joy, pure and unfiltered. Emma's heart twisted. She had worked so hard to shield Lily from rejection, to explain Linda's absence in ways that softened the truth without planting seeds of bitterness. And yet, here was her daughter's innocent faith wide open, believing without question that someone who had once walked away might now be ready to stay. On the car ride home, Lily couldn't stop talking about it. She described how she had seen her grandmother's smile from the stage, how she thought the flowers must have been for her, how it felt to know that someone else had come just to see her shine. "She looked proud of me, Mom," Lily said softly, almost shyly. "Like she was really my grandma." Emma gripped the steering wheel tightly, her mind racing. She wanted to dismiss it, to remind Lily of the years of absence, to guard her from disappointment. But when she glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her daughter's hopeful expression, she couldn't bring herself to crush it. Instead, she said, "I saw her too." Her voice was steady, but inside, every word felt like walking a tightrope between caution and surrender. That night, Lily curled into her blanket, her voice muffled as she whispered the question Emma had dreaded. "Mom, if people can say sorry, does that mean they're good again?" Emma froze. She sat at the edge of the bed, brushing her daughter's hair back gently. The innocence of the question carried the weight of everything she had been wrestling with: the letter, the silence, the sudden appearance at the school play. She knew this wasn't just about Linda. It was about what kind of world she wanted her daughter to believe in. Was it a world where mistakes defined people forever, or one where change was possible if it was truly fought for? "Sometimes saying sorry is the beginning," Emma said carefully. "It doesn't make everything good again right away, but it shows that someone wants to try. What really matters is what they do after they say sorry." Lily nodded thoughtfully, her eyelids growing heavy. "Then maybe Grandma's trying." Within minutes she was asleep, her small breath steady and peaceful. Emma remained in the room long after, watching her daughter's chest rise and fall. The dilemma weighed on her heavily. She could protect Lily by keeping the walls up, by refusing to let Linda close enough to wound her again, or she could take the risk of allowing her mother-in-law into their lives, hoping that this time the apology was more than words on paper. The choice was agonizing, because it wasn't just about Emma anymore. It was about the child whose heart was open and vulnerable. The next morning, Emma told Jake about Linda's quiet presence at the play and about Lily's questions. He listened without interrupting, his face lined with conflict. Finally, he said, "I don't know if she's ready, Emma, but I do know that if we shut the door completely, Lily will never stop wondering, and that wondering might hurt her more than the truth." Emma considered this for days. Each time she looked at Lily, she thought of the cycle Linda had repeated: rejection begetting rejection, silence breeding silence. Caroline's words returned to her, echoing like a warning: "Don't let her fear become your prison." Emma realized she didn't want to pass down a legacy of bitterness, no matter how justified it might feel, and so she made a decision. She would allow Linda a chance, but under her terms. She wrote another letter, shorter than the first, and mailed it without ceremony. She didn't promise forgiveness, she didn't promise closeness, but she set conditions: honesty, respect, and consistency. One chance broken, and the door would close again. Weeks passed with no reply. Emma began to wonder if Linda had decided the price was too high, if her apology had been only a moment of weakness rather than the start of true change. She told herself she was prepared for either outcome. But Lily's hope lingered, and Emma felt the pressure of her daughter's unspoken questions each time she asked, "Do you think Grandma will come again?" Then came the day of the spring concert at school. Lily had practiced her song for weeks, her small voice echoing through their apartment as she rehearsed. Emma and Jake sat near the front, pride swelling in their chests as they watched her take the stage. Emma noticed again the row of empty chairs reserved for family, the same sting of absence sharp in her heart. She reminded herself that she had tried, that she had extended the possibility. That was enough. The music began, Lily's voice rising clear and sweet above the others. Emma's eyes glistened with pride. She almost didn't notice the figure entering at the back of the room, hesitant and slow. But when she did, her breath caught. Linda stood once more, her hands clasped in front of her. No flowers this time, no attempt to intrude. She simply stood in the shadows, her eyes fixed on Lily, with a quiet reverence Emma had never seen before. She didn't ask for a seat. She didn't seek attention. She only watched, her face etched with humility and something that looked dangerously close to love. Emma felt the tension in her chest ease, if only slightly. For the first time, she wondered if perhaps the apology had been real, if perhaps the ice was beginning at last to break. But she also knew this was just the beginning. One presence, one letter, one silent gesture. It was not yet trust, not yet redemption. It was only a fragile first step. And as the applause filled the auditorium and Lily bowed with pride, Emma realized that the hardest choice still lay ahead. Because now, the next move would be hers. Would she let the wall crumble further, or would she rebuild it before it was too late? The sound of applause still rang in Emma's ears as the children filed off the stage, their paper costumes crinkling, their smiles bright with accomplishment. Parents shuffled in their seats, standing to gather coats and purses, voices overlapping with chatter about how wonderful the performance had been. But Emma's focus remained fixed on the back of the room. Linda was still there, half hidden in the shadows near the exit. Her hands clutched tightly around a small bouquet of wildflowers she must have picked up on the way. She hadn't moved forward, hadn't tried to take a seat or claim attention. She stood apart, her presence quiet yet undeniable. Emma's heart hammered in her chest. She had told herself she was prepared for this possibility, that Linda might one day show up again. But nothing had truly prepared her for the sight of her mother-in-law watching her granddaughter, with tears streaking down her cheeks. There was no malice in her expression, no sharpness, no control, only longing, humility, and fear. Lily was the first to notice. She burst through the cluster of children, her paper crown askew, her cheeks flushed with pride. "Grandma!" she cried, her voice carrying across the room. Heads turned, parents glanced at one another, curious but silent. Emma froze. She had not decided yet whether Linda was ready to be welcomed, but Lily had already chosen. Linda's lips trembled as she bent down to catch Lily in a tentative embrace. She didn't press too tightly, as though afraid the child might vanish if held too close. "You were wonderful," she whispered, her voice breaking. She handed the flowers to Lily, who accepted them with delight, holding them high as though they were a trophy. Emma stood rooted to the spot, her chest tight with conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to step forward, to pull her daughter back, to protect her from the possibility of disappointment. Another part of her wanted to let the moment breathe, to allow Lily's innocence to soften the sharp edges of the past. Around them, whispers filled the auditorium, but no one dared interrupt. Jake finally broke the stillness. He moved closer to his mother, his voice low, controlled. "You came." His eyes searched hers, not with anger but with a deep weariness, as though he had been waiting for this moment longer than he wanted to admit. Linda nodded, her gaze flickering between her son and Emma. "I didn't want to intrude. I just needed to see her." Her words were fragile, the tone of someone who knew she had no right to demand, but still dared to hope. Emma drew in a slow breath, steadying herself. Every eye seemed to be on her now, waiting to see what she would do. She felt the weight of years pressing down, the wedding, the rejection, the silence, the letter, the drawings, the questions. She thought of Lily's voice asking if saying sorry made people good again. She thought of the photographs taped to Linda's walls, the shrine built from distance and regret, and she realized this was the moment that would define what kind of legacy her daughter would carry. With measured steps, Emma crossed the room. She reached out and gently took Lily's free hand, grounding herself in her daughter's warmth. Then, after a long pause, she extended her other hand toward Linda. Her voice, when it came, was steady but quiet, carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. "This is your granddaughter, Linda. and she deserves more than silence. The room stilled. Linda's breath caught as she looked down at Emma's outstretched hand. For years she had wielded power through rejection, through distance, through sharp words that cut like knives. Now the power was gone, replaced with something she had no control over: grace. Slowly, almost fearfully, she placed her trembling hand into Emma's. The contact was brief, fragile, but it was real. Lily looked between them with a smile that glowed brighter than the stage lights had minutes earlier. She didn't understand the depth of what had just happened, but she felt it. And in that moment, her small world felt more complete. The whispers around them faded as people turned away, respecting the privacy of the fragile reunion. Emma squeezed Linda's hand once before letting go, her eyes steady. She was not offering forgiveness. Not yet. What she offered was opportunity, a chance to step into Lily's life with honesty, without the chains of the past dictating every step forward. Linda's tears flowed freely now, and she whispered, "Thank you," though her voice barely carried above the noise of parents gathering their children. Emma didn't answer. She simply led Lily out of the auditorium, Jake following close behind, his expression unreadable. In the car ride home, Lily chatted excitedly about the flowers, about how happy she was that her grandmother had come. Emma listened quietly, her heart torn between hope and fear. She knew one school play, one quiet appearance did not erase years of wounds, but she also knew something had shifted. The ice had cracked further, and beneath it ran the possibility of something new. Not perfect, not whole, but different. When they arrived home, Emma placed the flowers in a vase on the kitchen table. They looked out of place there, too bright, too sudden, like a symbol of something not yet earned. But she left them, because for all her caution, for all her scars, Emma understood one truth. Love, in its purest form, was not about erasing the past. It was about choosing, again and again, to face it. That night, as she tucked Lily into bed, her daughter whispered, "Mom, I think Grandma is trying." Emma kissed her forehead, brushing a strand of hair from her eyes. "Maybe she is, sweetheart," she said softly. "Maybe she is." And though Emma's heart remained cautious, she knew the choice had been made. The door was no longer locked. It was open, just enough for light to slip through. The morning after the school play, the flowers still sat on the kitchen table, their petals opening wider in the sunlight. Emma lingered over them as she poured her coffee, the sight stirring a mix of emotions she could not fully untangle. They were a reminder of the moment Linda had stood quietly at the back of the auditorium, not demanding, not controlling, but simply watching her granddaughter with tears in her eyes. For the first time, Emma had seen not a woman wielding bitterness, but a woman stripped bare by regret. Days passed and the silence between them no longer felt like rejection. It was different now, tentative, cautious, like the fragile pause before a bridge is crossed. Emma thought of Caroline's words, of the letter from Jake's father, of the years of pain that had shaped them all. She realized that none of it could be erased, and perhaps it shouldn't be. The past was the soil in which their present had grown, twisted and scarred though it was. But maybe, just maybe, something new could grow alongside it. One Saturday afternoon, Emma and Jake took Lily to the park. The air was crisp, filled with the sounds of children laughing and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Lily skipped ahead with her kite, her joy uncontainable. Emma sat on the bench, her eyes following her daughter, when she noticed someone approaching from the path. Linda. Her steps were hesitant, her hands clasped in front of her, as though every movement carried the weight of uncertainty. Lily saw her first. She dropped the kite string and ran toward her grandmother, throwing her arms around her waist without hesitation. Linda bent down, embracing her gently, tears spilling freely down her face. Emma's heart tightened, but she didn't move. She simply watched, letting the moment unfold. Jake stood beside her, his hand brushing against hers. "We can't undo what's been done," he murmured, his voice quiet. "But maybe we can choose what comes next." Emma nodded slowly. She knew he was right. The decision was no longer just about her pain. It was about Lily's future, about the kind of story her daughter would carry into her own life. Linda walked over with Lily, still clutching her hand, her eyes meeting Emma's. For a long moment they stood in silence, the weight of years pressing down. Then Emma spoke, her voice steady. "This is your grandmother, Lily, and today we'll take a picture together. Because family is not about forgetting, it's about rewriting what comes after." They sat on the park bench, Lily perched between them, her smile radiant. Jake pulled out his phone and lifted it with a trembling hand. "Everyone together," he said, his voice catching. And in that moment, with the click of a camera, something shifted. The photograph was simple. 3 generations sitting side by side, the past heavy but no longer insurmountable. When Emma looked at it later, she didn't see erasure. She saw rewriting. She saw love breaking through where bitterness once lived. That picture found its way into Linda's living room, framed carefully beside the first photo she had ever taken with Jake as a baby. The 2 images told a story not of perfection, but of change. Proof that cycles could be broken, that love could be chosen even after years of silence. Emma still carried her scars, and Linda still carried her regrets. But Lily carried something different. The memory of a day when her mother, her father, and her grandmother chose to stand together despite it all. The past hadn't been erased, but it had been rewritten with love. And for the first time, Emma believed that might be enough.